We are. Hi, everyone. I know some of your names. I'm Dr. Rob Kuntz, and I'm excited to be here to hear this presentation today. Uh, Stephanie is an incredible presenter, and she's going to knock us dead today with the topic of her dissertation called The Long-Term Influences of Toxic Leaders on Their Followers, a Qualitative Descriptive Study. So, Stephanie, the floor is
Great.
yours.
Thanks. Gosh, I have to knock people dead. I was just hoping to get through, Dr. Kuntz. All right. Well, thank you guys all for being here. As Dr. Kuntz said, my name is Stephanie Hinshaw. I'm going to speak with you today about my dissertation, which is the long-term influences of toxic leaders on their followers, a qualitative descriptive study. So before we dive into this, I'm going to talk a little bit about an introduction to the topic, just to familiarize everyone with what really the phenomenon of toxic leadership is, and then dive in later into the study. So basically, toxic leaders, simply put, are leaders who inflict harm on organizations and followers. So a lot of times we say in toxic leadership literature and research that their toxic leaders are leaders that leave followers and organizations worse than when they found them. And unfortunately, this phenomenon in toxic leaders are common. So according to a recent survey by the Society of Human Resource Management, it took place in 2019, over two-thirds of participants stated that they worked in a toxic environment, with half reporting their leader was actually the cause of the toxicity. Additionally, another survey most recently out in 2017 went to 1,000 college-educated participants, and of that, an astonishing 56% stated that they had worked for or are currently working for a toxic leader. So not only are these leaders harmful, but unfortunately they're very common. The current research supports both of those notions. So the current literature really shows that toxic leaders harm or negatively influence both organizations and followers. And I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides. You're going to see the harms that I discovered during the literature review part of my study, and it is really truly both organizations and followers. However, there's kind of a void in the literature right now. There's plentiful amounts of literature when it comes to talking about the harms that toxic leaders cause when they are employed at an organization or when followers report to them. However, there's scarce literature really around how that influence continues to linger, or if it does, after the followers no longer report to the toxic leader. Specifically, I think I was only able to find about 5 studies in my literature review around this area, and all of those studies really built on historical data from other studies, and none of them really included the participants' voices or the followers' voices. So what this study that we're going to talk about today is it builds upon the prior research and extends our understanding of toxic leaders' influence by considering the voices of the past followers of toxic leaders. And really the goal of this study is to create more of an understanding around this negative leadership and improve awareness of what toxic leadership is. So that's really the gist of this study and the background to introduce you to toxic leadership in my research. The purpose of this qualitative descriptive study was to describe how followers continue to be influenced by a former toxic leader after followers no longer report to the toxic leader. So that's a really important nuance there, is we're understanding how those followers really describe their experience after they no longer report to their toxic leader. And that's a very unique part of the study. And I'm going to talk about the selection criteria used to ensure that I was actually studying the right phenomenon here in a few slides, in case anyone's wondering about that. And then the research question that guided this study was, how do toxic leaders influence followers who no longer report to them? So that was the center sounding point in question of this study, is really trying to understand how toxic leaders continue to influence their followers after they no longer report to them. And then the aim of this study was to use basically everything we just talked about, the purpose, the goals, to really be able to use what was learned in this research to illuminate additional reasons why organizations should prevent and mitigate the influence of toxic leaders. So again, adding to our understanding of the toxic leadership phenomenon. And then the hope there was that this could be potentially used to incite change of what we accept in leaders from our organizations or even aspirationally as a society. And then last but not least, the aim of the study was to inform organizations and leadership consultant training programs. So you'll see that a little bit later when I discuss the proposed solution in the study. So that's really the background information about the study. I'm going to transition a little bit into what I discovered during my literature review. So obviously needed to understand what the literature currently said about toxic leadership and their harms to be able to inform my study. And there are two major themes that I'm going to present today. I'm not going to go through my whole literature review because that's not as fun as the findings. But there are two major themes that came out. And really that was the conceptual and empirical definitions that are on the slide now. And then the next screen, which you'll see, which are basically the harms and the influences of toxic leaders. So what I learned when I was researching toxic leadership is just like most things in academic and research, there's not just one definition. Toxic leadership from a conceptual standpoint, the term was actually introduced in 1996 by Marcia Wicker in her book, When Good Organizations Go Bad. And what she basically proposed is she said that some of these great organizations were going bad and it was the result of these toxic leaders. And she described these toxic leaders as very evil. Specifically, she used 6 mouths to really describe toxic leaders. She said they were maladjusted, malcontent, malevolent, they were malicious, and then they were malfunctional, and they engaged in malfeasances. So basically, she painted this picture of a truly evil leader, and that could turn a good organization into bad or cause it to be ruined. And that was great. That was revolutionary. It was the first time that term was being used. The book was well received. However, the term was very concrete. It really painted toxic leaders as completely evil. And that was kind of the same theme that Reed came to the scene with in 2004. Reed offered the definition of toxic leadership for the military and basically described, again, a very poisonous leader that was very concrete. But over time, really, our understanding of toxic leaders have evolved. So we really don't accept in research anymore that toxic leaders are all bad. Instead, we really look at this as more of a continuum, is kind of the term I use here. And really that was the result of Jean Lippman-Blumen's seminal work in 2005. And she offered a conceptual framework that basically introduced a little bit more grayness into toxic leadership. She espoused that, one person's toxic leader could potentially be another person's good leader, depending on how they viewed things. And she also painted this picture that you could have very evil toxic leaders, like the people that were engaging in the unethical activities, the illegal activities, all the way down to the more passive leaders that just weren't cultivating people. But where the majority of toxic leaders really existed were somewhere in between. And some of those items were pitting followers against one another, inciting people to take action by using their fear, building silos, being able to make themselves seem grander than what they are and more powerful. So that's where a lot of this kind of continuum and the interesting part in my perspective of toxic leadership really came, is where it became not so cut and dry. And then other definitions were offered by Padilla et al. And Pelletier that are widely recognized. But again, we really do lean on still Lippman-Blumen for the most conceptual framework there. But all three of those really were more of that continuum kind of work of toxic leadership. So those were the conceptual definitions that were found in the literature review. Additionally, one empirical definition is really used a lot in toxic leadership research, and that was offered by Andrew Schmidt. In 2008, he created the toxic leadership scale, which is actually used in this research study. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later. But basically what he basically did is created a tool that we could use to be able to have in research to kind of gauge if somebody is a toxic leader or not, for lack of better words, to simplify that. And there were really 5 major dimensions that he used there: abusive supervision, authoritarian leadership, narcissism, self-promotion, and unpredictability. So those are really the definitions that exist in the literature right now. The second major theme in the literature review that informed this study, and I alluded to a little bit ago, is really the toxic leadership influences. So as I started off this presentation, I said, toxic leaders are leaders who inflict harm on organizations and followers, and that's really offered at a conceptual level. The good news, or I guess good news for alignment, not necessarily good news overall, is that the literature and the research supports that notion. Specifically, the current literature, which is plentiful, is very definitive when it talks about toxic leadership harms. Specifically, there are organizational harms that the research supports, as well as individual harms. And then as you can see across the bottom of this slide, there also is a relational influence. And so that relational influence is really going to potentially influence those organizational or individual feelings as well. So I'll talk about that in a moment. So without getting too much in the weeds of this, because I could talk about it forever, is that on the organizational literature, we learn from the current research and the researchers that toxic leaders negatively influence organizational performance. One thing I found really interesting here is that also not only does it impact toxic leadership organizational performance in the long run, it actually impacts people's perceptions of organizational performance. So there's research studies there that support that the followers of toxic leaders believe their organizations are performing worse than those that are not. So thus it's realized, as well as also sometimes just perceived organizational performance. Additionally, toxic leaders have been linked to a decrease in organizational learning and innovation. A decrease in organizational citizenship behavior. So on the flip side, they're also linked to a positive increase in workplace deviance, counterproductive workplace behavior, bullying. So really, they're negatively impacting the citizenship behavior at organizations. And then last but not least, toxic leaders are linked to an increase in organizational cynicism. So people that report to toxic leaders tend to feel more cynical about their organization than those that don't. So that's really on the organizational side. On the individual side, and I think it's important before I talk about this, I do want to also just quickly note that within systems thinking and the living organization system, which organizations are, that there's always going to be overlap between the individual versus the organizational. Meaning that if there's a lot of negative job satisfaction in followers, and that they have a higher turnover intention, that could potentially decrease organizational performance. So where these are in two different buckets on the screen, there's obviously going to be some overlap between the two. But going back to individual, toxic leadership has really been linked to a negative job satisfaction from followers, which in turn relates to turnover intentions. So people that report to toxic leaders are more likely to turn over. And then they also relate to a higher level of stress. So the followers of toxic leaders report feeling more stressed. They also have, paranoia. They also have within that stress bucket a decrease in sense making. So all of these items kind of lead to an increase of stress. And additionally, toxic leadership is negatively related to effective well-being of followers. So in the literature and in the research, we learned that effective well-being is influenced by depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, overall health complications, and toxic leadership is linked to a decrease in that in followers. And then last but not least, toxic leadership is linked to coping strategies. So anytime people are asked to cope with something, they have to change their behaviors. And that in turn can cause a stress or a strain in those individuals. Thus, the followers of toxic leaders tend to have to adjust themselves to cope with the situation they're in. And then along those lines, again at the bottom, the relational really come back to the three selves, the individual self, the collective self, and the relational self. And so what we find with the relational kind of influence in this is that coping strategies are actually positively impacted or influenced when people can relate to other people about their experience. So if they have a support system within their network also experiencing it, that can actually minimize the influence. And if they don't, and they feel like all the kind of abuse is targeted towards them, then they actually feel it a little bit deeper. So that's kind of where that relational thread, for lack of better words, lives in relation to the coping strategies and strength of influence. And then the last thing on the screen, which I thought was really interesting, is that there was a relational influence on the perceptions of toxic leadership. So people actually rated their own leaders that are toxic leaders lesser of a toxic leader for the same behaviors for those leaders that are not their own leaders. So it's kind of like the in-group versus out-group. So again, along this whole individual and organizational harms, there's this nice relational thread that is very interesting. So that's really what the current literature shows, and that was used to inform this study. So moving on to this study. So I chose to use a qualitative descriptive study for this dissertation. And basically qualitative descriptive studies, they are used for researchers who really want to stay close to their data, when they want to present things in a very factual way, be able to really have terms and everyday terms and straightforward for anyone to really be able to interpret. And if to quote Dr. Bloomquist here, and I don't know if she's on the call, but qualitative descriptive studies, the researcher doesn't really put on any lens to interpret the data. Instead, they look at it in a really factual manner. And the reason I really chose this, and I want to make sure I acknowledge this here because some of you are on my past faculty members, I always thought I was going to do a phenomenology. And so when I first started working with Dr. Kuntz, he really pushed me on that. It helped me understand that I didn't necessarily have an interpretive framework to be able to interpret the data because there was no real studies about how the followers described this experience. Thus, the qualitative descriptive study allowed me to be able to not put any lenses on or any frameworks on when interpreting the data. Instead, I was able to truly just let the data shine. So really, that is the method used in the study. It fit the study very well, again, especially because little to no information is available about the research that that I conducted. So with that in mind, not only do we have to consider what research method or design we're using, obviously there were ethical considerations in this study. As you can see, there were definitely two that were more pronounced than the others, but I'm going to go through all of these quickly for you all. So for participant rights, I informed all participants with an informed consent, and of course anyone could withdraw from the study at any time. So they had the ability to leave at any point in time. Anonymity, I can never say that word. I told you, Dr. Kuntz, that was going to trip me up. And confidentiality were a big part of my study. Specifically, I had people talking with me about very sensitive information, sharing a lot of very kind of harmful information for organizations and or people if it would get out. Thus, making sure that I kept all data de-identified was very important. So what I did is I de-identified all information as it came in, stripped all names, organization names, toxic leader names, if they gave names of colleagues, stripped that, state, city, so on and so forth. So that way it was really basically de-identified. I also used generic terms when reporting, such as participant 1798. I kept everything on a password protected storage device that only I had access to. So that was a big part of the study. The other part of the study, which is one that I was really worried about, and I had talked to Dr. Georges a couple of times, is, how can I make sure that I'm presenting this data without any of my own, bias in there? And so I really, really worried about reliability and data validity. So thus I employed a lot of different strategies here to ensure that the data that I'm presenting is truly true to form. And so how I did that is I piloted my interviews, the interview protocol. I did 4 practice interviews. I engaged an expert panel review. So I had some individuals that were experienced in qualitative research meet with me, review my research questions, provide feedback. Dr. Kuntz and Dr. Wardlaw both provided feedback. And then, so I really made sure that that interview protocol was, as solid as I could. After completing the interviews, I engaged in member checking with my participants. All of the participants reviewed their transcripts to ensure that they were valid and accurately presented what was, took place in that interview. And then last but not least, I reused an external reviewer. So I employed somebody that was very experienced in qualitative research, and I was lucky enough that she reviewed all 440 pages of my transcripts, codes, and categories to ensure that I wasn't putting something into the analysis that wasn't there. And then, of course, I engaged in reflexivity and bracketing along the way. The last two, not as much on this one. I did not use a site. I didn't have any conflict of interest. So what I basically did is just made sure that I conducted all interviews outside of work hours and used all equipment that belonged to me. So those were the ethical considerations in the study. So on to the exciting part, participants. So I recruited my participants by using a combination of network and snowball sampling. Specifically, I posted one post on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And in the spirit of snowball sampling, it was reshared by many people in my network. So those of you on the call that reshared them, thank you. And as a result, within 14 days, I had over 90 people who were interested in being part of this study. So I basically stopped recruitment. I had enough to be able to work people through the pipeline. Of those 90, 88 provided valid contact information. So that is how I've recruited the participants. And so moving on to selection, and I'm not sure if Dr. Bloomquist is on here or not, but if she is, I do want to acknowledge Dr. Bloomquist, because in ILD 813, she really sat with me and helped me with the selection criteria, because I really was studying a unique phenomenon. I was trying to study people who reported to a toxic leader and no longer did. And I didn't want to continue to, interview people that continue to work for a toxic leader. I also didn't want to interview people who thought all leaders were toxic. So the selection criteria was very specific. And again, Dr. Bloomquist really helped me refine that. So thank you if you're on the call, Dr. Bloomquist. And what I basically did is, back on the couple slides ago, I talked about an empirical definition, and I said Andrew Schmidt created this toxic leadership scale. Is I used the toxic leadership scale. I had all interested participants. I sent out this survey, and I had them complete it for both their past toxic leader as well as their current leader. And I only selected those individuals for the study that scored their toxic leader at or above a composite score of 4.62, and their current leader at 2.22 or below. And along the bottom of the slide, it explains this, but I want to explain it briefly to you, is when I created those bounds based on the data that Schmidt cited when he created the toxic leadership scale. He basically, concluded that 3.42 was the average toxic leadership scale and 1.2 was the standard deviation. So I basically combined the average composite score with the standard deviation to create the bounds to make sure those individuals truly worked for a toxic leader in the past and don't anymore, thus studying the correct phenomenon in this study. So the selection criteria was very, very, very critical to this study, and ended up being just really interesting also too. So basically, I used that selection criteria that I just described. 60 people completed the toxic leadership questionnaire for both leaders. And of those 60, 27 met the selection criteria, so about 45%, roughly where I had anticipated it to be, a little bit lower, I thought, but nonetheless, about 45% met the selection criteria. Of those 27, I scheduled 21 interviews and 18 people attended. One person I determined during the interview was not qualified. They were not working. Thus, I completed the interview, but did not consider any of their data or their interview in my data analysis. So I ended up with 17 participants. The participant information is in the last column there. They were predominantly females, predominantly very highly educated, predominantly white, and 12 of the 17 worked in education-related fields, and the other 5 worked in public or nonprofit. One of the things that I also wanted to study, and Dr. Kuntz and I talked a lot about this when we were really working on my dissertation and getting it to where it was, is I also wanted to ascertain how their professional relationship with their toxic leader ended, and also how long ago it was. I had piloted my interviews so people had very different scenarios and found commonalities. And I also wanted just to capture that as data, but not use it as a reason to not interview somebody. And so in that study, I found that 15 of the 17 either resigned or transferred. So only 2 of those individuals had their toxic leaders removed. And then the participants really ranged for how long ago they reported to a toxic leader. Some of them were within a year, all the way up to people that had reported over 10 years ago. So a lot of variety in that component. So those were the participants in the study. I used 2 data collection tools. First one, as I've discussed numerous times already, was the toxic leadership scale. It's a 6-point agreement scale: to strongly disagree, to strongly agree, for 30 questions. As I shared before, it's widely used and accepted in toxic leadership research, and the validity and reliability has both been tested and confirmed. So I felt very confident in using that tool. I also used interview protocol for my interviews. I formed that from using best practices. I started with an interview statement, background questions, moved into the more specific phenomenon questions, and with follow-up questions. As I shared before, I both piloted the interview questions and had them reviewed by an expert panel. I put a couple of sample questions on the slide there to give you guys a flavor of what the questions were. They were very broad, very, very big, for lack of better words, allowing people to really talk about the influences that they felt that they had in their lives. So those were the two data collection tools. Data collection procedures. So I've really already talked about the first two here: participant recruitment, participant selection. Interviews, as shared with you before, I did use an interview protocol, and I conducted all of my interviews on Zoom. All were recorded, and everybody did use webcams. From there, I had transcripts. I used rev.com to be able to get the human transcription for more reliable results, and I also kept field notes. So that resulted in roughly about 450 pages of transcripts and field notes at the end. And then I used thematic analysis to really analyze my data, which I'll describe in the next slide. All right, so here's my data analysis strategy that I employed. I used a three-phase coding process, and I used MaxQDA to help keep me organized. I started off with open coding. At the end of open coding, I had 522 codes. Of those, 72 were related to background. So that's that background information I just talked about that I was capturing to understand when they reported to leader, a toxic leader, how their relationship ended, the field they were in. So that's the background questions that I captured. 99 were emotional. So that's something I'll talk a little bit about later, but do want to foreshadow that is people got very emotional in these interviews. 11 out of 17 participants either cried or were holding back tears and told me they were holding back tears. So I had 99 different codes assigned with the emotions. And then 18 codes was basically their time of telling how the toxic leadership ended, which was an interesting finding in its own. And then 33 codes were really the meat of the codes. They were in vivo codes, and they were the ones that really answered that question or attempted to answer that question: how do toxic leaders influence followers who no longer report to them? So that's what I ended up after my open coding. I moved to axial coding to condense the codes and move them in a more higher order approach. And really that was for those 333 in vivo codes. The other ones were, retained because there were more background information. And at the end of that, I ended up with 12 codes and 15 subcodes. And then I finally moved over to selective coding and came up and finalized with 6 categories and 10 subcategories. So that's the data analysis process I used to produce these categories. So I'm not going to talk too much about the categories on this slide. I will talk about them in the future slides. But as you can see, there were 6 categories that I determined answered the question: how do toxic leaders continue to influence their followers that no longer report to them? And they are, for the most part, pretty negative. 4 of these 6 categories are negative, 2 are positive, and 4 of the categories had subcategories underneath. I do want to pause there and just explain. I decided to use the word categories versus themes for my study, and that was because some of the researchers that I had read about recommended that for qualitative descriptive study to really say that you were staying closer to the data. Thus, I used the word categories versus themes. So this is where I landed at the end of the selective coding process. What I also was really happy about when I really started to think about the findings is that there was actually a lot of synergy between the codes and the categories. And that really was important because a lot of times in thematic analysis, if you come up with categories that are synergistic and sometimes overlap, that shows that maybe you have a synergy of truly coming up with a better answer to that research question. So I have this little diagram here to kind of show that interconnectedness. For example, if someone's changed as a person, it's going to potentially influence the other areas as well. And if somebody is, influenced in a negative way for self-confidence, that's more than likely going to influence their current work lives. So thus, there was a lot of synergy between the categories after they were finalized. So I'm going to move into the categories now. I do want to just kind of explain how I structured these slides. So when you're looking at them, they make sense to you. I'm not going to read all of the quotes. I'm not going to read any besides one at the very end. But true to qualitative descriptive study, you're supposed to amplify your participants' voices. So I felt very felt very compelled and passionate about offering sample quotes in this dissertation defense because that's the spirit of qualitative descriptive studies, and I wanted my participants' voices to be heard. So thus you're going to see either 3 or 4 sample quotes slide. If there are multiple subcategories, you'll see that on the left-hand side with A, B, and C, or A and B if there's only 2. And then the quotes are really going to embody one of the major, the overall category, as well as the subcategories. So that's how to look at these slides. I did want to offer that to you. I'm going to speak in more broad terms, but in case you do want to read those in more detail, that's how these slides are set up. So the first category was the one that really kind of shook me to my core. This was one that was more profound than what I thought I would find. And I went off to study how toxic leaders continue to influence followers who no longer report to them. And what I heard from every single one of my participants was that they didn't consider it as an influence. They considered that experience changed them as a person. And so the depth of that finding and kind of the gravity of it was not something I expected to find in the data, so it definitely surprised me. And they talked about that in a lot of different ways. You can see from the first quote here, they talked about it in big terms, as well as the participants offered 3 distinct ways how they were changed as a person. The first way was health implications that are forever part of the story. So the participants in this study shared how they were on anti-anxiety medicine or anxiety medicine, depression medicine, how they had to take FMLA from work, how they couldn't sleep. One person was actually checked into a psych ward, and they had these ailments that happened during the time of working for a toxic leader. And what they basically wanted to share with me was that, yes, those ailments do go away. Just like anytime you get sick, they go away, but they're forever part of your story. That time you spent not well can never be erased or completely rectified. So because of that, they were changed as a person, especially in some of those more serious medical and health implications. The second theme that really surprised me on this was that the participants described this really as a trauma. The words that were used here were trauma, abuse, Stockholm syndrome. And as I shared with you, participants were very emotional. I had 11 of 17 and some kind of emotional, with really 7 people truly crying during the interviews. And, you know, according to the US Department of Health and Human Services, trauma is really stress or strain that persists after either an experience or one event or a series of events that causes stress or strain that never really fully goes away. And that's basically what the participants said, that they felt this was a traumatic experience that is forever with them. And then last but not least in this category is that participants described how this experience stunted their career growth. I had participants really in 2 different ways here. One was to be able to say that, you know, during this time they didn't grow because they were so worried about survival, they didn't grow as a professional. And then still others talked about how it impacted the positions they applied for afterwards and maybe took steps back in their careers because of the experience and how they felt. So really category 1 was that they were changed as people, and that this was deeper than just an influence. It was really changing them as a human being. The second category was more aligned with what I thought I would find. And that is really the participants described that their current work lives were currently influenced by their past toxic leader. And they described this really in 2 different ways. The first way they described this is that they said that their past experience with their toxic leader influenced their emotions and thoughts at work. So for example, participants shared with me that if their boss sent them a note to say, let's come meet, can you meet me in my office? They thought they were getting fired. Or they had to check themselves that they weren't bringing something to the conversation that wasn't really there. So they had to kind of almost self-regulate their thoughts and emotions because they were programmed to think differently. What was really interesting too is they realized that, but yet they still had that initial emotional reaction. And the same is true of the behaviors and actions at work. So participants shared that they still behaved and acted in ways more aligned with their toxic leader than actually their current work environment. And again, they were very aware of this. So they over-communicated, asked for permission, put everything on their calendars, and they still behaved in that way even though their current environment didn't require them to do that. So their current work lives were still influenced by that experience. Third, a more positive category, I've sprinkled in the positive ones throughout this, was leadership. So are the participants in the study, 14 of the 17 to be precise, discussed how their experience of working for a toxic leader influenced either their leadership practice or their general thoughts about leadership. And so when it came from their own practical and personal leadership experience, they really discussed how they worked very hard to intentionally not be a toxic leader and how they self-regulated and were bettered themselves through learning to be a better leader, so they were never a toxic leader. And it was a driving force behind their leadership practice. Additionally, the participants talked about how it helped them understand leadership better, comparing and contrasting positive and negative leadership, and being able to just learn some leadership lessons from observing what not to do. Fourth, unfortunately, this one is not as positive, self-confidence. So really self-confidence talks about the individual's ability to be able to recognize and realize their ability, their emotions, their thoughts, and really have self-love. And unfortunately, 13 of the 17 participants discussed having a lack of self-confidence in each of these areas. So first and foremost, judgment. The participants used a word, again, Stockholm Syndrome, and they talked about really doubting themselves for staying in that quote unquote professional relationship with that toxic leader for so long. They questioned their judgment of character, their judgment of what to expect, their judgment of not taking action. So there was a lot of lack of confidence in the judgment that they had for themselves. Additionally, they also expressed a lack of confidence in abilities. So I had the privilege of interviewing some very, seasoned individuals with very high level positions, and they talked about sitting at the table, and unfortunately, they, what they basically did is they said that, hey, I know that I should have this position. I know I'm really good with this. Having said that, I still hear these voices of the toxic leader in the back of my mind, and it makes me question my abilities and my worth at the table. So that was something that continued, to quote one of my participants, haunt them after they actually left that position. And then the last subcategory was one of the most, I don't know how else to describe this. It was the hardest one for me, if I'm just going to be really honest and vulnerable. It surprised me, and it was very difficult for me. And it was they lacked confidence in their feelings about reporting to a toxic leader. I had numerous participants ask me questions to the vein of, am I normal? Or I'm participating in the study to see if I am the problem, or, do other people feel this way? And so again, that was hard as a researcher, to keep the researcher hat on, because a lot of people doubted their feelings and that their feelings were valid after reporting to a toxic leader. So self-confidence really was across all three of those areas. Moving on to a related but different category, which is ability to trust. There are no subcategories with this one. The last two don't have subcategories. And so the ability to trust, trust is really the ability to put your faith in somebody else and make yourself vulnerable to somebody else who can control something that matters to you. And so 13 of the 17 participants discussed how they were hesitant to trust now. And they described that at both an individual level as well as a personal level, individual and organizational level. And in that individual, it was both with other colleagues as well as just people in general. And then also many participants described, talking about loving their organization they're in right now and believing they had good intentions, but still wondering if it was. And so there was just a really hesitancy to trust and make oneself vulnerable to other people that the participants described. And last, certainly not least, is the other positive theme. So this was one that was expressed by 13 of the 17 participants. Again, you can hear that these themes are really pronounced. It wasn't like 5 of the participants, it was the majority of the participants in these categories. And this is the positive one of the participants expressed appreciation for their current work situation. And what I mean by that is they expressed gratitude for things that we would think are normal. So having somebody that, cares about them, or being able to leave and not feel this dread the next day, or the heaviness of having to have mind space attributed to work and their boss at home. People for being included in conversations and knowing how decisions were made. And then last but not least, I said I was only going to quote one quote here, and it's the first quote on the screen, is that they were more appreciative of having a good boss. It wasn't lost on the participants that not everyone is afforded the luxury to have a boss that truly cares about their well-being. So having somebody that cared about their well-being was something that kind of felt earth-shattering, which again, I'll save my comments, but something that shouldn't be so rare. So they expressed that appreciation for those little things. So with that being said, those are the categories that really inform the proposed solution. And Dr. Kuntz can tell you, I got a little depressed sometimes on this part of this because I felt so little, because I felt so compelled by my study and just worried so much about the participants and other followers of toxic leaders. And, you know, how do you fix this? And I know that I'm just one little person and much more is needed. So I think that became kind of heavy for me at some points, but nonetheless, I did come up with a potential solution, which is a leadership culture code. And it was really aligned by the dissertation. Specifically, the overall theme is that my whole dissertation centered on amplifying the followers' voices and empowering them and giving them the trust and the confidence to make sure that they know that they are quote unquote normal for feeling the way they feel. And so the leadership culture code is very similar to kind of a mission statement or company value statement or vision statement, or more specifically, even more similar to diversity and inclusion statement. Specifically, what I mean by that is a lot of companies have vision statements, mission statements, and recently have added a diversity and inclusion statement to signify a concerted, intentional effort to make sure that there are diverse and inclusive efforts at their organization. A leadership culture code uses the same premise and says this is our intentional focus and commitment to a leadership culture at our institution. And so it's very similar in that spirit. And the goal of that, which is aspirational, would be to eradicate toxic leadership from an organization. And so by creating a very public-facing, intentional culture code, for lack of, again, better words here, leadership culture code, the goal would be to have really two major tenets created, which is awareness of what is effective leadership and accepted leadership, as well as accountability for those leaders to live up to those standards. And again, it empowers the followers to be able to really be able to know what is good leadership. So let me show you what I mean. So this is a leadership culture code example that I created. So as you can see, it kind of has the feel of company values, organizational values. It has some very tenets here. So at this, culture code for XYZ organization, we would say at XYZ organization, our leaders are responsible for creating safe, supportive, collaborative environments where our team members can grow and use their strengths to excel. We believe leadership requires empathy, innovation, and a desire to learn. The following statements outline who XYZ leaders are and how they behave. And then as you can see, there are very specific tenets of what are expectation of leaders in this leadership culture code. And just a note here, I formed this leadership culture code from what the participants in my study shared with me. I used the opposite. So a lot of times I heard that toxic leaders never put people first. They were always putting themselves first. So thus the opposing one was the tenet that was included here. So again, it's a very concentrated, intentional effort to outline what is appropriate leadership at an organization with the goal of eradicating the negative leaders. Having said that, that's only one part of the solution, but I only have 30 minutes, which I'm already over. So I apologize, everybody. So I cannot get into all of this, but I did want to let you know there's a little bit more in the dissertation to this. The leadership culture code solution is actually a 4-step solution that's being proposed. And the first step is the creation of the statement that we just saw. The second one would be awareness. So making sure that, a communication plan happens where this becomes a centerpiece of the website, where this is communicated broadly to all stakeholders and making sure that people are all aware of that. So there's definitely a communication strategy there. Step 3 would be training. So a key tenet of the leadership culture code solution that is more unique is that it focuses on training the whole organization. So a lot of times you see leadership training for only those leaders or potentially future leaders, and you don't train followers on what to expect for leadership. And so this leadership culture code solution has training designed for both the leaders as well as the followers to be able to make sure we're approaching leadership from both angles. And in that training for the followers, it includes includes what acceptable leadership is, and also some ways to be able to address it if you do see toxic leadership, and how you report it, or how can you engage in those conversations that are maybe tough to be able to let people know how you're feeling. So it definitely empowers the followers, which is, again, different here. And then last but not least, we focus on accountability in the leadership culture code solution. And that's holding leaders accountable. An organization would need to create, basically a reporting chain for people who are not in line with this. We would have to have 360 feedback surveys, skip level meetings, again, having a whole culture of accountability that if I was a leader and somebody else was a leader and they weren't engaging in this way, that I could hold them accountable as well. So it's a culture of accountability as well that this leadership culture code solution is proposing. All right, so moving on to implications, a lot of different implications here. I know Creighton wants us to always do practical and leadership implications separately, but they're kind of intertwined in my study because the whole study centers around leadership. Is basically the study extended our understanding of toxic leadership by listening to the participants describe how they were influenced by a prior toxic leader. And then really what really came from this is that the followers don't believe these are just bad bosses that they reported to. Instead, they really said they harmed them as people and they changed them as people. So it extended our understanding and basically maybe even gravity of the understanding of toxic leadership at this point. So this study asked us to think critically about the role that leaders have in lives and how they truly do influence people both in and outside of work. Future research, I saw additional research opportunities throughout the entire time. I kept saying, oh gosh, I wonder about this, and how to remind myself that I didn't finish this first and then hopefully be able to do more research. So one of the research items, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is I didn't have a very diverse group. I had hoped for more diversity in my participants, but I didn't. So I think a future research would be, doing a similar study with this with more diverse participants and making that intentional. We could do a phenomenological study now that we have the interpretive framework of potentially abuse or trauma that came up in this study, or even a quantitative study with that lens. Grounded theory, I kept thinking multiple times is what is the process that people go through to leave and also start healing from this experience? So there's definitely a grounded theory, I think, study in there somewhere. And then another one that I always wondered about, and I'm so interested on this, is once somebody leaves a toxic leader, is there a certain type of leader that is more effective of having those people heal and having less influence of that? So that's definitely another study. And then additionally, one of the other things that came to mind is, does your past toxic leader influence you on how you feel about your current leader? Specifically, do you see them more toxic than what you would because of your past experience? So lots of research here. I probably could have filled a whole slide with it, but again, how to get this study done first. And then last but not least, for conclusion, if I'm leaving here and the major takeaway, I guess, I hope that you all get from this, and thank you for being here to listen to me and I hope ask questions, is that toxic leaders are not really bad bosses. Sometimes at organizations we say, oh, that's just Sam, or, oh, that's just Jerry, or that's just so-and-so, and we write off behaviors that actually are toxic, and we think, oh, they're just a bad boss. Well, this study helps us and encourages us to think that, writing those things off and bad bosses are more than just bad bosses. So from an aspirational angle, I hope that this study and future research that I hope I will be privileged enough to do will help us understand more about toxic leadership and make people less accepting of toxic leaders. And then lessons I learned a lot of discernment along this way. As many of you know, I came to Creighton and I knew this is what I wanted to study, but I had to really learn what mattered. And so Dr. Kuntz was really instrumental in that with me, is about, we can engage in great conversations about what really mattered in my study and what didn't. So I really, really learned discernment. And then another part that was really hard for me, and Dr. Wardlaw, warned me about this a little bit, is it was really hard. I didn't anticipate how hard my research was. It was very dark. The interviews were very hard. Sitting with all the data and the transcripts was very difficult. And so that was definitely harder and took a different toll on me than what I thought it would. And then the last thing is I'm just excited. I'm so excited for this, hopefully to be a springboard and to bring you more awareness for toxic leadership. And I'm so very grateful for the journey. So with that gratitude, I'll come to my last slide. I need to thank my committee members. I was so fortunate to have a fantastic committee. Dr. Coons, I cannot thank you enough. Dr. Coons challenged me, supported me, and somehow balanced both. I felt like he was truly like celebrating the good things and also really helping me when it was negative. So thank you, Dr. Coons. And then I was very fortunate to have Dr. Wardlaw as a faculty member 2 times, and he taught me so much in those classes about being more succinct with writing, toxic leadership, kindness, and just cannot thank him enough for the feedback as well. So I'm very fortunate for my committee members. So thank you to the 2 of you. Create and support, Dr. Georges. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Dr. Georges helped me every time Dr. Martin told me people couldn't complete in a certain amount of time. She said there always has to be a first, and helped me be able to really create this path for myself. And then from a personal level, she also very much helped me when I was dealing with some imposter syndrome. So thank you, Dr. Georges. I alluded to this during my presentation. Dr. Bloomquist really helped me refine my selection criteria. She challenged me and she pushed me and spent an hour on the phone with me until we got it. So thank you, Dr. Bloomquist. And then my dissertation support group. I don't know, I'm sure they're here. I got so fortunate to have a wonderful cohort. And then every other Tuesday night, we end up meeting to support each other. So Sandy, Dave, Ashley, Ophelia, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I don't know how we would have done this if we weren't together. And then, of course, my husband, he was the one that I survived my wife's dissertation journey. Thank you for supporting me for the goal of a lifetime. And then most importantly is I can't thank the study participants enough. They were so open with their stories and just gave me so much trust and vulnerability, and I'm just so grateful for them. So with that, that is the end. I went over. I'm so sorry, Dr. Coons. I knew I would. I tried to make it less. And I think I turn it over to you now, correct?
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to. I generally would open it to the floor, but I just wanted to turn to Dr. Wardlow and ask, did she kill it or did she kill it?
Yeah. I've been sitting here thinking this is just so amazing, and yeah, she killed it. Yeah. Good job. Really good job.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. When we saw her proposal presentation, I remember one of the first questions that I asked her after she finished was, Stephanie, do you have a lot of presentation experience? And she, oh yes. And I said, well, it shows. I said, you are going to knock them dead in the end. So anyway, you did. You delivered the goods well. So thank you very much. At this point, I'm going to open it to the floor. And Lydia, if you are listening to us, this is the first Zoom final presentation that I've done, and so I don't really know where we stop or go, but let's open it to the floor for questions.
Yeah, Dr. Coons, generally the committee will ask their questions if they have any first. So if you guys don't have any, then you can open it up to faculty in the EDD program and then other attendees, students, family members as well.
I have shared a lot of emails and comments back and forth with Stephanie, so I'm going to leave her alone at this point. Dr. Wardlow, do you have any additional questions for her?
No questions at this time, though I would like to have a follow-on conversation in the next couple of weeks. I have some follow-on questions to ask you about your dissertation, but nothing relevant to today.
Thank you.
So we open the floor to anyone who would like to speak.
Stephanie, it's Leah Georges. Nice job on your presentation today. I have a question primarily about something you and I had talked about and you mentioned today, which is how close you are to this topic, right? You've experienced toxic leadership, and this is a profoundly important topic for you that you'd like to take out professionally to help others not experience what you did and similar experiences. You mentioned some of the things that you did to sort of bracket yourself out and in the data. You mentioned external reviewer. Can you tell us who that independent external reviewer was, if not by name, sort of what role that external reviewer played?
Yeah, I am connected with a lot of people just because of higher ed that have a lot of qualitative experience. So the reviewer was somebody who actually is in a research group through an organization that I'm part of and does a lot of qualitative research. So what she basically did is I sent all the transcripts over after they were de-identified. She reviewed all of those. I sent the categories and basically the codes to be sure that they were, aligned. Luckily for me, there wasn't really a lot of changes. There were some suggestions for how I worded some things, Dr. Georges. So some different words there, but overall the category stayed intact after that review. So that's how I use that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I'm curious for, just for the research credibility generally, and also all 50 some people on this call that will be defending dissertations, how did you bracket yourself well, right? So, I mean, when you were listening to the interviews, transcribing the interviews, how often did it come up where you needed to consciously think about your own bias and your own experiences, and how then did you mitigate those things beyond sort of the formal moments that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I kept a journal. So I had a little handwritten journal that I basically forced myself to write about every single day, even if I felt like I didn't need it, Dr. Georges. And so sometimes you can kind of see like there was a lot of thoughts at the beginning and at the end there weren't as many. It was actually really interesting. Something that happened to me along this journey is that I became more kind of obsessed with telling my participant story, that mine kind of went wayside. And I'm not saying that it still wasn't there. So please know I'm not saying that all of a sudden I forget what it's like to be a person who reported to a toxic leader, because that's not the case. I just became so kind of obsessed with getting this story out because people were so generous with their conversations and what they offered to me. But nonetheless, I did keep a journal and I basically did it every single day, regardless if I wanted to or not. And then I kept notes for myself in the interviews as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephanie.
You're welcome. And you're right, I worried about that very much. You saw the reliability and validity steps I took.
Hi, Stephanie. This is Dr. Ford. Thank you for your
Hi.
presentation. I have several questions for you. First of all, you said that you called your themes categories because a particular author said that was okay. Which author is that?
It was Morseri. I think I'm going to say it wrong. But basically, I reviewed Sandalewinski, Braun and Evans, Kalfari and Evans, and then Morseri et al. And, if I tell you which one exactly right now, I'm probably going to tell you, but I believe it was Morseri, which is basically for qualitative descriptive studies, said they used and recommended for those studies to use categories instead of themes to imply that their deep interpretation was not done. So that is why I did that, Dr. Ford.
Okay, that's unusual. So when you present, if you decide to do this to a research conference, less to a practitioner audience probably, but to a research conference, you probably want to explain that. I have read quite a bit of qualitative research and have not heard that distinguishing aspect of it. Of course, you have a citation. Of course, you went with that author, so that's legitimate. I just wanted to know more about that process. Okay, second of all, you mentioned this more than once, but I was wondering if you would go into more depth. How did you distinguish toxic leadership from a bad boss? Was it by the scale? Was it by what they said? That part seemed a little cloudy to me.
Yeah, so it was definitely by the scale. So I used the empirical scale that Andrew Schmidt created in 2008. It's a toxic leadership scale that has the 5 dimensions of toxicity. And the different dimensions are abusive supervision, authoritarian leadership, self-promotion, narcissism, and unpredictability. And those are on a 30-point scale, and they're an agreeable, a 1 to 6 agreement scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And so that is what I used to ensure that I was studying toxic leadership and not just a bad boss. And so how I did that, Dr. Ford, is that in Schmidt, when he created that scale, he determined basically the cutoff, for lack of better words, or average score of a toxicity toxic leader, not just a bad boss, was 3.42. And then the individuals that in the standard deviation there was 1.2. So basically everyone I talked to, I combined the standard deviation with the average. So they were at or above 4.62. So they were at that very high level of the area. So I wanted to make sure I wasn't talking to people that had a somewhat toxic boss and then a somewhat not. And so that's where that 4.62 to the 2.22 for the non-toxic current boss were combined to have the participants. So does that answer your question?
That makes sense. Tell me more how you might have, a survey is a survey, right? An instrument is an instrument, I should say. So did you see any differences in the answers among your participants that might indicate there's a range in there? I don't have a predetermined answer. I was just wondering what you heard.
Yeah, honestly, I didn't dissect a lot of that, Dr. Ford. That wasn't part of my study. It was really more, once they fit the selection criteria, I didn't go back for the quantitative perspective to then compare and contrast there. So that wasn't really in the bounds or what I was attempting to do. So I could only probably pontificate and kind of, guess right now, but
no,
that really wasn't what I was doing.
I didn't make my question very clear. I apologize.
Oh, okay.
Did you see differences in your participant responses in the descriptions of their experiences that might indicate a range?
Got it. Okay. So basically, like for what their composite score was the end, did I see variances in that? Yes, I did. Yeah. So 4.62 and the highest was 6. So sometimes I had people that were at 4.62. Sometimes they were at 5.58. So there were definitely variances there. Same for the current leader. I had people that were like at 2.2 versus 1, and they also did score different things differently. So as far as, some people have toxic leaders that are much more narcissist than what they are abusive. And thus you could have certain categories that really did stand out in those answers. So there was variances in that. But again, for the purpose of this study, I didn't really dissect those to an nth degree because I was really using that for the selection overall.
That makes sense. That's your instrument that you're explaining, and I appreciate that. Did you see differences in their qualitative responses in your interviews?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So there were themes. Yeah. So I think one of the things that I, again, could see is that you had people that sometimes were kind of, and this goes back to the question I brought up, are sometimes certain leaders more apt at helping people heal than other leaders. So it was very interesting as I would have people that I was talking to that perhaps never, had been out of their toxic leadership situation that were still crying about it on the call, where I was talking to other people that had only been out for a couple of months or like 6 months, and they still talked about it very matter-of-factly and felt more confident. So there's definitely, there were themes of it, but the ranges of emotions that people felt definitely did vary. But again, there were definitely commonalities about it that I was able to speak to in this research, but nonetheless, there were definitely nuances in there.
Okay, thank you. And then I have one other question, a little bit different take on this. I know you didn't have much time to talk about the leadership culture code. I certainly appreciate the time limits and that the literature review can take more time than we realize it's going to. How does this is a yes/no question, so I'll follow it up with an open-ended question after that. Does the leadership culture code assume every leader is toxic unless you have this culture? And then depending on, tell me more about whether you answer yes or no.
No, it definitely doesn't assume that every leader is toxic.
How does it not assume that?
Yeah, a leadership culture code would be just as powerful for a leader that's a really strong leader because it also provides them framework to be able to expand their leadership practice. And so a leadership culture code could be applied to anyone. I consider myself a servant leader and I consider myself a strong leader, but a leadership culture code could still very much apply to me because I could help me be more intentional with my practice. It could help me explain to people on my team why I do certain things. So it also could help good leaders. I hope I can call myself one, such as myself and other leaders still improve their leadership practice. So it absolutely doesn't assume that everyone is toxic, but nonetheless, it does help to eradicate it because that's what my study is about, toxic leadership.
True. So which organizations do you think you would advocate using that for?
Well, it could be used in any organization. I mean, this is a multidisciplinary, I'm in an interdisciplinary program. Leadership is interdisciplinary. This is not something that could be just in higher ed. It's not something that could just be in nonprofits. It could be used anywhere leaders are employed. And that is, you know, the whole spirit of our program. It's interdisciplinary leadership. So of course, there's going to be certain organizations that are more apt to that, right? Just like some organizations are more in tune to diversity and inclusion statements and more values added. So I definitely think those would probably be more receptive to this. Nonetheless, it doesn't necessarily matter by discipline, in my opinion, or size of organization. It was written in my dissertation very broad that a large range of organizations could deploy this.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Stephanie.
Thank you for the questions, Dr. Ford.
You're welcome.
Oh, and Dr. Kuntz, thanks for adding my citation up there for me.
Oh, sure. Yeah, you're welcome.
I didn't write down which one it was. I was like, ah.
I had your dissertation pulled up, so yeah.
Thanks for helping me out. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Other questions? Great
Hi,
questions.
Stephanie. It's Dr. Mbighe here. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. You did really great on your presentation, and you have a lot of your peers are here. It was so cool to see all the students here supporting you. So I have one question. Is it feasible or even possible that a toxic leader could be perceived by senior leadership as being a really effective leader?
Absolutely. Happens all the time.
Okay, so tell me more.
Yeah. So toxic leaders, a lot of times in the framework, so if we talk about this, there's one of the dimensions that, and it comes across a lot in the literature as well as my study, is that toxic leaders can change who they are by how they present themselves with who's around them. So what you tend to see in the toxic leadership scale is the self-promotion dimension, Dr. Moss-Green. Oh gosh, I forgot your last initial now. I apologize. Is you see that, Dr. MBK, thanks, Dr. Kuntz. I'm like, oh gosh, I apologize. But what you see in this is that you also have people that can become very charismatic. I've got everything done. I've got it all under control. They can present themselves very well to upward management, but once they're behind closed doors with their team, it's kind of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And thus, that is why sometimes organizations do have toxic leaders employed much longer than really what we think they should have. And so really that whole leadership culture code, and really what I'm contending here is that it's all about empowering the followers' voices so they're not stifled, and it's not just the upward management being able to see or hear those results. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And this is a great topic and lots to talk about on it as well, but I'll stop and let others ask questions too. So great job. Thanks, Stephanie.
Great, thank you.
Other questions? One last shot. Try to take her down. I don't think you'll succeed, but try.
I love questions. Questions are great.
So Lydia or Dr. Georges or Dr. Ford, whoever can answer this question. This is my first Zoom call, final defense. Normally we would have everyone go away and Dr. Wardlaw and I would talk, but how do we just wrap it up right now, or?
Nope. So if you and Dr. Wardlaw will stay on, we'll ask everybody to log out. If you've arranged with Stephanie, do you have her phone number or an email address? You can have her log back in. Stephanie, you can log back into this same meeting and they can talk to you over this.
Stephanie, if you can give Dr. Wardlaw and I 5 minutes, I think we can have our discussion and we'll go